Marissa Hale's name shouldn't be in Judge Rowan Pierce's files, yet there it sits, flagged red in a case sealed 7 years ago, whispering accusations through manila folders that smell of dust and buried mistakes. She doesn't know his face authored part of her exhaustion, that his signature once carved a path toward her current desperation. He doesn't remember her specifically, but the cold recognition of his own capacity for harm makes his hands tremble as he reads. The single mom worked a double shift to pay the fine. Hours later, a judge asked why her name was in his files. Two strangers bound by a decision neither can escape. Subscribe to witness the collision. Judge Rowan Pierce's chambers smelled of leather and old coffee, the kind of space designed to insulate its occupant from the messiness of human desperation that flooded the courtrooms beyond his oak door. The afternoon light came through tall windows at an angle that made everything look like it belonged in a museum. Preserved and untouchable, dust motes suspended in amber shafts that never quite reached the corners where shadows pooled like standing water. He sat at his desk with the posture of a man who had learned to carry authority in his spine, shoulders squared even when alone, even when the weight of his black robe hung on a brass hook across the room, and he wore only shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. His fingers moved across a stack of case files with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual he'd perfected over 2 decades on the bench. Each manila folder, a small universe of consequence he would open, consider, and close again. But this afternoon something snagged, a name highlighted in yellow on a cover sheet that shouldn't have been there at all. A file that, according to the date stamp and classification code, should have remained sealed in the basement archives, where mistakes went to decompose in darkness. The name read Marissa Hale, and beneath it a case number from 7 years prior, and beneath that a notation in his own handwriting that he didn't immediately recognize, but knew with sickening certainty was his. Rowan's jaw tightened as he pulled the file closer, as if proximity might help him understand why the automated system had flagged it now, why it had surfaced like something drowned finally bloating to the surface of a still lake. His memory of the case itself was vague, reduced to the kind of abstract impression that thousands of rulings created, a face he couldn't quite picture, a situation he'd distilled down to legal precedent and sentencing guidelines, a decision rendered with the clinical detachment that the job demanded and that he'd cultivated like a second skin. Yet the notation troubled him, because it referenced a discretionary judgment he'd made, a choice to apply maximum penalty where leniency had been possible, and the words he'd written to justify it now seemed hollow and performative, the language of someone protecting his reputation for severity rather than pursuing actual justice. He felt a coldness spread through his chest, the kind that came not from temperature, but from recognition, from the slow understanding that he might have authored someone's suffering with a careless stroke of his pen. The file contained supporting documents, transcripts, financial statements, photographs of evidence that meant nothing to him now, but that once must have seemed definitive. Marissa Hale had been 25 then, charged with a minor offense that normally would have resulted in community service or a small fine. But Rowan's notes indicated he'd chosen to make an example, to demonstrate consistency in enforcement regardless of circumstance, to show that his courtroom operated on principle rather than sympathy. The financial disclosure form showed her income at the time, minimum wage from 2 part-time positions, no assets, a dependent child listed as 3 years old. He read those details now with a kind of numb horror, seeing them not as abstract data points, but as the architecture of a life he'd made harder without ever considering the human being behind the paperwork. The maximum fine he'd imposed would have been devastating for someone in her situation, and the mandatory court costs he'd added would have compounded the burden, creating a spiral of debt that she'd likely never escape because the system was designed to trap rather than rehabilitate. Rowan set the file down and pressed his palms flat against the cool surface of his desk, trying to steady the tremor that had started in his fingers and was now working its way up his forearms. Outside his window, Detroit spread itself in layers of brick and concrete, the city's bones visible where decline had stripped away pretense, neighborhoods where people like Marissa Hale lived their entire lives without ever entering spaces like this one. He'd grown up differently, suburbs with lawns, schools with resources, a father who was also a judge and who taught him that authority was a kind of armor you wore to protect yourself from the chaos of other people's poor decisions. Rowan had inherited that philosophy along with his father's law books, and his tendency toward emotional remoteness had built a career on being the judge who never wavered, who never let personal feelings corrupt the purity of legal reasoning. But sitting here now with Marissa Hale's file open before him, he felt the armor crack, felt something cold and accusatory seep through the gaps. The system had flagged her name because she had an outstanding balance from that original fine, interest compounded over 7 years into a sum that now exceeded her annual income. And according to the automated notice, she was scheduled to appear in his courtroom tomorrow afternoon for a hearing on non-payment. The coincidence felt like punishment, like the universe forcing him to confront a ghost he'd created and forgotten. He pulled up her current information on his computer, violating protocol but unable to stop himself, needing to see what had become of the young woman whose life he'd casually made harder. The database showed multiple addresses over the past 7 years, each one in a neighborhood slightly worse than the last, a geographic record of downward mobility that told its own story. Her employment history was a patchwork of service jobs, fast food, retail, cleaning services, the kind of work that ground people down through sheer physical exhaustion while paying barely enough to keep them housed and fed. There was a notation about wage garnishment that had been in effect for 3 years, meaning a portion of every paycheck she earned was automatically diverted to pay down the debt he'd imposed. A mechanical extraction that happened before she even saw the money. Rowan closed his eyes and saw his own signature on that original order, remembered the righteous certainty he'd felt when he'd decided to be strict rather than merciful, when he'd chosen to uphold principle at the expense of a struggling young mother he'd never thought about again until this moment. The afternoon light had shifted by the time he finally closed the file, the amber shafts now slanting toward evening, the shadows in the corners growing deeper and more accusatory. Rowan knew he should simply recuse himself from tomorrow's hearing, hand the case to another judge, and let the system grind forward without his direct involvement. But something in him resisted that escape. The flagged file felt like an invitation or an indictment, a chance to see the consequences of his judicial philosophy made flesh, to look into the face of someone whose suffering he'd authored and acknowledge it rather than hide behind professional distance. He wondered what Marissa Hale looked like now, whether 7 years of poverty and exhaustion had marked her visibly, whether she would recognize him as the judge who'd sentenced her all those years ago, or whether she'd forgotten his face the way he'd forgotten hers. The thought of their confrontation tomorrow made his stomach clench with something that might have been dread, or might have been the first stirring of conscience he'd allowed himself to feel in years. A sensation so unfamiliar, it took him a moment to name it as guilt. Marissa Hale's feet had stopped registering individual sensations of pain sometime around hour 11 of her shift, and had settled instead into a general throb that radiated up through her ankles and knees, into her lower back, like a constant low-grade alarm her body no longer had the energy to heed. The smell of fryer oil had saturated her clothes, her hair, probably her skin, creating an invisible cloud that followed her everywhere and that no amount of cheap body spray could mask, a smell that announced her working-class status to anyone with a functioning nose. She stood at the industrial sink in the back of the fast food restaurant where she worked her first job, scrubbing at a burn mark on a metal tray with a determination born not from perfectionism, but from the desperate need to avoid giving her manager any reason to dock her hours or write her up for incomplete tasks. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a frequency that made her teeth ache, casting everything in a greenish pallor that made everyone look slightly unwell, as if the building itself were a symptom of some larger sickness in the world. Her second shift started in 40 minutes at a grocery store 3 bus rides away, where she would spend another 6 hours on her feet, running a register and bagging groceries, while customers complained about prices she had no control over, and managers monitored her bathroom breaks like she was a prisoner on work release. Between the 2 jobs, she would earn just enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and maybe, if nothing broke and nobody got injured and no unexpected expenses materialized out of the chaos that defined her life, put $50 toward the mountain of debt that had been crushing her for 7 years. The debt had started small, a fine she'd thought she could pay off in installments. But then the interest had kicked in, and the court costs had been added, and suddenly it was this living thing that grew faster than she could cut it back. A financial cancer that metastasized through every aspect of her existence. She'd tried to negotiate with the court system, had spent hours on hold with clerks who were sympathetic but powerless, had sent letters that went unanswered, had watched as the garnishment orders came through and sliced away portions of her paycheck before she ever saw it. The worst part wasn't the money itself, but the way the debt had colonized her imagination, turning every thought about the future into a calculation of impossibility. She couldn't go back to school because she couldn't afford to work less, couldn't move to a better apartment because the security deposit was beyond her reach, couldn't save for emergencies because every spare dollar went toward a fine she'd incurred when she was young and stupid and had made one bad choice that apparently defined her forever. Marissa's 9-year-old daughter, Kayla, didn't know the specifics of their financial situation. But children had a way of absorbing their parents' stress like second-hand smoke, and sometimes Marissa caught her daughter doing math in her head at the grocery store, calculating whether they could afford the name-brand cereal or if they needed to stick to the generic. That kind of premature awareness broke something in Marissa every time she witnessed it. Made her feel like she was passing down not just poverty, but a particular kind of vigilance and anxiety that would mark Kayla for life. Tonight's double shift had been particularly brutal because the heat had broken in the restaurant's kitchen and the temperature had climbed to something approaching hellish, the air thick and wet like working inside someone's mouth. And 2 other employees had called in sick, leaving her to cover their stations in addition to her own. Her manager had promised her overtime pay with the kind of vague assurance that meant nothing, that would probably translate into a few extra dollars that would immediately be garnished anyway. But she'd nodded and said thank you, because saying anything else risked being labeled difficult or ungrateful, labels that could cost her the job entirely. She'd burned her forearm on the edge of a fryer basket around hour 8, a red welt that throbbed in time with her pulse. But she'd run it under cold water and kept working because leaving early wasn't an option, and filing an incident report would just create paperwork that might complicate her life in ways she couldn't afford. Pain was something you worked through. Exhaustion was something you ignored. Suffering was the baseline condition of survival in her economic bracket. As she finished with the last tray and dried her hands on a rough paper towel, Marissa caught her reflection in the stainless steel surface of the walk-in freezer door, a distorted version of herself, stretched and warped, looking older than 32 and worn in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that gave her a headache. Her face bare of makeup, because there was no point in trying to look polished when you were going to spend 16 hours sweating over industrial cooking equipment. her eyes carrying the particular flatness of someone who'd stopped expecting things to improve. She thought about tomorrow's court hearing with a dull sense of dread. Another afternoon wasted in a courtroom where people in suits would speak to her in tones of barely concealed contempt, where she would have to explain yet again that she was trying her best, but that her best wasn't enough, that the system had backed her into a corner where there was no good choice, only gradations of surrender. The letter she'd received had been formal and threatening, suggesting that if she couldn't demonstrate progress on the debt, she might face additional penalties or even a warrant, words that made her stomach twist with the ancient fear of losing custody of Kayla or ending up in a cell for the crime of being poor. She clocked out and walked into the winter rain that was falling in a steady grey sheet, the kind of cold that worked its way through cheap fabric immediately and settled into bones, making her shoulders hunch and her teeth chatter as she waited at the bus stop with 3 other people who looked equally defeated by their circumstances. The city at night was all harsh fluorescent lights and wet pavement, storefronts closed behind security gates, neighborhoods where hope had been strip-mined long ago, and what remained was the stubborn refusal to completely disappear. Marissa thought about the judge who would hear her case tomorrow, tried to imagine what kind of person chose to spend their life passing judgment on people like her, wondered if they ever considered the human cost of their decisions, or if they'd trained themselves to see only legal abstractions, numbers on forms, rather than lives being lived in the margins of impossible circumstances. She would stand before this judge and try to explain what it meant to work 2 jobs and still fall further behind, to parent alone while running on fumes, to exist in a state of perpetual emergency where every day was a crisis barely averted. But she doubted any of that would matter, because the law didn't care about exhaustion or context or the way poverty ground you down until you were just trying to survive one shift at a time. Rowan Pierce arrived at the courthouse 90 minutes early the next morning, a habit formed over decades that usually gave him time to center himself before the performance of authority that his position required. But today, the extra time felt less like preparation and more like prolonged dread, each minute stretching uncomfortably as he sat in his chambers and rehearsed what he might say to Marissa Hale when she appeared before him. The building itself was a monument to institutional coldness, all marble floors and high ceilings designed to make visitors feel small and temporary, the architecture of power making its judgment before any human judge spoke a word. He'd always appreciated that about courthouses, the way they communicated hierarchy through sheer physical mass. But this morning, the symbolism felt obscene, felt like part of a larger machinery designed to intimidate people who were already vulnerable, to extract compliance through aesthetic intimidation rather than reasoned argument. His coffee had gone cold in its cup while he stared at Marissa Hale's file, now so familiar he could have recited its contents from memory. Each document a small indictment of his younger self's certainty that strictness was the same thing as justice. He'd spent the evening before doing something he'd never done in his career, researching the aftermath of his own ruling, tracing through databases to see what had happened to Marissa Hale in the 7 years since he'd imposed that maximum fine and moved on to the next case without a second thought. What he'd found was a textbook example of how the legal system could destroy someone slowly and methodically, how a single punitive decision could set off a cascade of consequences that compounded over time, like interest on an unpaid loan. The garnishment had made it impossible for her to save money, which meant when emergencies arose, a car repair, a medical bill, a period between jobs, she'd been forced into predatory lending arrangements that carried their own crushing interest rates, creating additional debt that further limited her options. She'd been evicted twice, according to public records, which meant application fees and security deposits and moving costs that drained whatever small reserves she might have accumulated, resetting her financial situation to 0 or below. Her credit score had been demolished, which in turn made everything more expensive, from car insurance to security deposits, creating a poverty tax that punished her daily for the crime of having been punished initially. The cruelty of it struck Rowan with physical force as he sat in his expensive chair, surrounded by law books that promised equal justice under law, promises that his own actions had revealed as hollow marketing rather than actual principle. He'd believed when he imposed that fine that he was upholding standards, discouraging repeat offences, demonstrating that his courtroom operated according to consistent rules rather than emotional whims. But what he understood now, with the kind of clarity that felt like vision returning after years of functional blindness, was that he'd been performing strictness for an audience of other legal professionals, protecting his reputation as a judge who couldn't be manipulated by sob stories, sacrificing Marissa Hale's actual well-being to maintain an image he'd confused with integrity. The person who would appear before him this afternoon had been ground down by a system he'd helped operate, and he couldn't escape the recognition that her exhaustion and her debt and her narrowed options were at least partially his doing, authored by his signature on documents he'd signed without considering their human cost. His clerk knocked and entered with the morning's calendar, moving with the efficient deference that Rowan had always enjoyed, but that now seemed vaguely obscene, as if the power dynamics that made people careful around him were part of the same poisonous system that had destroyed Marissa Hale's financial life for 7 years. He asked about her case specifically, keeping his tone neutral, and learned that she'd confirmed her appearance for the afternoon session, that she'd requested to be heard last so she wouldn't have to miss more than a few hours of work. A small detail that spoke volumes about the calculations poverty forced people to make, weighing the risk of judicial punishment against the certainty of lost wages. The clerk had no particular opinion about the case beyond its procedural status, saw it as just another debt enforcement hearing of the type they processed dozens of each month. An attitude Rowan recognized because it had been his own attitude until yesterday afternoon, when her name had surfaced from the sealed files like an accusation made visible. He spent the morning hearing other cases with only partial attention, his mind circling obsessively around the coming confrontation, trying to imagine what he would say when Marissa Hale stood in the well of his courtroom and looked up at him from behind the defendant's table. Would she recognize him from 7 years ago, or would his face have blurred into the general category of authority figures who'd passed judgment on her over the years? Would he acknowledge their history, or would he maintain judicial distance, treating her like any other debtor appearing before him for enforcement proceedings? The ethical guidelines were clear that he should recuse himself, given his personal involvement, but he'd already decided not to do that because recusal felt like cowardice, like hiding from the consequences of his own decisions behind procedural technicalities. He wanted to look at what he'd done, wanted to see the human cost of his judicial philosophy made flesh before him, wanted to feel the full weight of his responsibility, even if it made him uncomfortable or forced him to question assumptions he'd carried for 2 decades. The lunch recess came and he ate nothing, his appetite gone, replaced by a tight anxiety that made his chest feel compressed, his breathing shallow. He reviewed her case one more time, noting the specific amounts she owed, the original fine plus 7 years of accumulated interest and fees, a sum that now totaled more than most people earned in 6 months, an insurmountable number for someone working minimum wage service jobs and raising a child alone. The legal mechanism that had generated this number was impersonal and automatic, interest rates set by statute, fees mandated by administrative rules. None of it designed by any individual with malicious intent, but all of it combining to create a machine that crushed people efficiently and without remorse. Rowan had helped build and maintain this machine through his rulings, through his insistence on strict enforcement, through his refusal to exercise the discretion that might have shown mercy. And now he was going to have to face one of its victims directly and decide whether he had the courage to do something different or whether he would hide again behind the protection of procedure and precedent. When the afternoon session began and the bailiff called the calendar, Rowan found himself listening for her name with an intensity that made his jaw ache from clenching, his hands gripping the arms of his chair like he was bracing for impact. The other cases moved past in a blur of legal routine, his responses automatic, his mind already in the conversation he would have when Marissa Hale finally appeared. He wondered what kind of person she was, beyond the financial data and employment records, whether she was angry or resigned or something more complicated, whether she saw herself as a victim of an unjust system or blamed herself for decisions that had started the cascade 7 years ago. He wondered if she had people who loved her, if she had moments of joy amid the grinding difficulty of her circumstances, if she'd managed to give her daughter a childhood that wasn't entirely defined by scarcity and stress. These were questions he'd never asked about any defendant in his career, questions that violated the professional distance he'd maintained as a form of self-protection. But this afternoon, that distance felt less like objectivity and more like moral failure, a refusal to acknowledge the humanity of the people whose lives he affected with his rulings. Marissa Hale entered the courtroom at 10 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, wearing clothes that showed the evidence of a rushed change between shifts. Her work pants slightly damp at the cuffs from rain, her jacket still carrying the ghost of fryer oil beneath a layer of dollar store perfume. Her hair pulled back so tightly it created a tension headache that throbbed behind her eyes in time with the fluorescent lights overhead. The room was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded. All dark wood and brass fixtures, and that peculiar courtroom smell of old paper and floor wax, and something else she couldn't name. But that felt like accumulated judgment. Decades of verdicts rendered and sentences imposed, creating an atmosphere of inescapable authority. She clutched her folder of financial documents with hands that wanted to shake, but that she forced steady through sheer will, telling herself this was just another performance of respectability she had to give. Another situation where her survival depended on convincing powerful strangers that she was trying hard enough, that she deserved some small consideration, even though the system was designed to assume the opposite. The bailiff directed her to stand at the defendant's table, and she obeyed automatically, her body trained by years of service work to respond to commands from people in positions of authority without visible hesitation or resentment. From this position, she could see the judge elevated above her on the bench, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of posture that came from never having to apologize for taking up space. His black robe transforming him into something more than human, a symbol of law itself sitting in judgment on her accumulated failures. Marissa kept her eyes down mostly, glancing up only in brief flickers because direct eye contact felt dangerous somehow. Felt like it might provoke the kind of anger she'd learned to avoid in men with power over her circumstances. The room was nearly empty at this late hour. Just a court reporter and a clerk, and the bailiff standing by the door like a promise of enforcement if she failed to show proper deference. And the emptiness made everything feel more personal somehow, less like institutional process, and more like individual humiliation performed for a small audience. Judge Pierce's voice when he spoke was different than she'd expected, not harsh or contemptuous, but careful, almost hesitant, lacking the performative authority she'd heard from other judges who'd presided over her various court appearances over the years. He stated her name and case number, confirmed her identity, then paused in a way that felt unusual, his eyes moving from the file before him to her face and back again, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that troubled him. Marissa responded with the required affirmations. "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct." Your Honor, the ritual language of courtroom submission that she'd learned came more easily, if you just stopped thinking about what the words meant and let them become pure performance. She waited for the standard lecture about responsibility and consequences, the speech every judge seemed to have memorized about people needing to honor their obligations and accept the results of their choices. Words that would be technically accurate, but that would completely miss the reality of trying to parent alone while working poverty-wage jobs in a city that was slowly collapsing under the weight of decades of disinvestment. But the lecture didn't come. Instead, Judge Pierce asked her a question that caught her completely off guard, his voice carrying something that might have been actual curiosity rather than rhetorical setup. He asked her to explain her current employment situation, not in the formal language of the financial disclosure form, but in her own words, what her days actually looked like, what she was doing to try to pay down the debt while supporting her daughter. The question felt like a trap, because kindness from authority figures always did. Felt like he was inviting her to relax so he could spring some punishment on her when she let her guard down. But she was too exhausted to maintain elaborate defenses, so she just told the truth. She described her double shifts, the two jobs that together barely added up to a single living wage. The bus rides between workplaces that 8 hours she should have been spending with Kayla, the way the garnishment took money from her check before she ever saw it, which meant she was constantly calculating from a starting point of deficit rather than zero. She described trying to budget for food and rent and utilities while the debt grew faster than she could pay it, how the interest rate meant she was essentially running in place financially, making payments that barely touched the principal while the fees and penalties continued to accumulate. Judge Pierce listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but something in his posture suggesting that her words were landing differently than she'd expected, that he was hearing them not as excuses, but as information that troubled him in some fundamental way. When she finished speaking, there was a silence that stretched uncomfortably, the kind of pause that in service jobs would have signaled that she'd said something wrong and should brace for consequences. But then he did something she'd never witnessed in a courtroom before. He set down his pen and leaned forward slightly and acknowledged in plain language that the system had failed her, that the original fine he'd imposed 7 years ago had been excessive given her circumstances, that the compounding interest and garnishment had created a situation that was effectively inescapable, and that punishment had long ago stopped serving any legitimate purpose and had become simply cruelty operating on autopilot. The words hit her with such unexpected force that she felt her careful composure crack, felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of being seen, of having someone in authority actually acknowledge what her life was like, rather than dismissing it as the predictable result of her own poor choices. He said something then that made her look up fully and meet his eyes directly, made her forget for a moment the performance of deference she'd been carefully maintaining throughout the hearing. He said that he was the judge who had sentenced her 7 years ago, that he'd found her file flagged in his system and had reviewed his original ruling and recognized it as an example of the kind of judicial harshness he'd once believed was principled, but now understood was simply punitive, that he'd been thinking about her case constantly since discovering it, because it represented his own failure to exercise the mercy that justice sometimes required. His voice carried something raw and undefended when he said this, like he was confessing rather than rendering judgment, like this moment was costing him something emotionally and he'd decided the cost was worth paying. Marissa didn't know how to respond, because no script she'd learned for interacting with authority figures covered a situation where the authority figure admitted fault, where power acknowledged its own capacity for harm and took responsibility for specific damage it had caused. Judge Pierce then did something that would probably violate multiple judicial ethics guidelines, and that Marissa knew she would remember for the rest of her life, regardless of what happened next. He vacated the original fine entirely, eliminated all accumulated interest and fees, terminated the garnishment order, and expunged the case from her record as if it had never existed, erasing 7 years of compounding consequence with a series of signatures that took less than 2 minutes to execute. He explained in quiet, formal language that the court had discretion to reconsider excessive penalties when new information suggested the original ruling had been unjust, that while this was unusual, it was within his authority, that he was exercising that authority now because continuing to enforce the debt would be participating in harm he could no longer justify. The practical effect of his ruling was that she would walk out of this courtroom free of a burden she'd carried so long it had become part of her identity, that her paycheck next month would be whole for the first time in years, that the debt collectors would have to stop calling, and the threat of additional legal action would evaporate like it had never been real to begin with. Marissa stood at the defendant's table, crying openly now and not caring who saw it. 7 years of accumulated exhaustion and fear and grinding desperation, breaking through the careful control she'd maintained through every humiliation and setback and moment when she'd wanted to simply give up but couldn't, because Kayla was depending on her to survive. Judge Pierce signed the final document and handed it to the clerk, then looked at Marissa one more time with an expression that might have been seeking forgiveness, or might have been simply acknowledging the inadequacy of legal remedies to address the damage that law itself had caused. She didn't know what to say to him, so she said thank you, in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper, words that felt completely insufficient, but were all she had available. He nodded once and told her she was free to go, and Marissa walked out of the courtroom into the winter evening feeling like she'd been released from a weight she'd forgotten she was carrying. Like she might actually be able to imagine a future that didn't involve drowning slowly in debt accumulated from a mistake she'd made when she was 25 and desperate and didn't know yet how the system would punish her forever for being poor at the wrong moment. She stood on the courthouse steps in the rain and let it wash over her face, and thought about Kayla, and thought about the hours she'd have back now that she wouldn't need to work quite so many doubles, and for the first time in years allowed herself to feel something fragile and dangerous that might have been hope.